Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
Let's pray. Father, we do thank you for your goodness to us. We thank you for the minds that you've given to us to be able to think your thoughts and to think accurately about the universe. And thank you for the guidance you give to us in your word and by your Spirit. And I thank you, Father, for all the marvelous things that you have allowed your creation, your human creation, to do and accomplish. We glorify you for that. We're saddened when people forget about you and those pursuits, but help us, Father, to be truly appreciative of what mankind has produced in culture and art and so forth. And one day it will all accrue to your honor and glory publicly for all to see. Direct our class time today. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, this will bring us to the third of the Schaeffer videos on tracing through the movement of thought in the West in regard to the issue of worldview. And it is the Renaissance. This is a very interesting lecture because the Renaissance produced some of the great art and architectural and so forth treasures of the world. And the Renaissance also did something in regard to thought and in regard to the elevation of the reason of man, the thought of man. And this becomes a pivotal period and a lecture in the way Schaeffer puts together this movement of thought. So as we look at Renaissance, again, I've given you a terms list. He talks about something being subordinated, and that is placed under something else as less important. And one of the things that we've already seen in that regard in the movement in the West philosophically, theologically, was the importance of the Bible as the basis for truth, and it's going to be placed more and more under man's reason. Classical he will use as devoted to Greek and Roman culture. You tend to use classical as something that your parents liked in music, and you don't. But that's not how he's using it, okay? It's having to do with Greek and Roman culture. Autonomous, we've seen before, we'll see again, self-governing, independent. Personification, a person or thing thought of as representing some quality or idea. Byzantine, that should be of art, pertaining to art, not or art. And here it's designating or of the decorative style of the mosaics, frescoes, etc. of the Byzantine Empire. I think the dates with this would be something like the 4th through the 15th or 12th to the 15th centuries. By a lack of perspective, rich use of colors, especially gold, emphasis on religious symbolism. So Byzantine is the culture. Byzantium was the center of this, is the Eastern Church and great influence. And so he will refer to this in regard to architecture, in regard to art, and it does reflect a religious worldview, but remember one that had become symbolic rather than real life. And so he will mention that. He will use Madonna a number of occasions. He's not talking about the pop star, okay? It's too bad she has that name. A Madonna, it's actually used as a noun, is any picture or image of the Virgin Mary. So when he uses that, don't be put off by what pops into your head. Now in this particular session, look for these two things. What's the basis for truth from the humanist viewpoint? And that's something that he will emphasize more and more. And then the other thing, interesting, what did Michelangelo's statue David communicate, and what was wrong with that? So there'll be a lot of art and sculpture and so forth that he will mention. And again, he's going to mention how this reflects worldview and how people think of the world. Okay, what main points of this presentation of the Renaissance? Who wants to start? Yeah, Daniel.
The focus of art shifted from God towards man with the creations.
Okay.
Realization of space and the whole focus on man.
Okay, you said the focus of art shifted from God toward man, but was that what it was about? There was another shift from flat representational art to, realistic, a real people in a real world. And he makes the point that wasn't all a shift away from God. And he said, at a certain point it could have gone either way. It could have gone to where the whole movement, maintained the idea that God is at the center of it. This is His world, real people in His world, or it shifted to man at the center, and that is what the Renaissance predominantly became. Okay, what else? What else did you pick up here?
Man was able to do anything.
All right, the result of the thinking that is portrayed in the art and so forth is man is at the center, and man will be able to solve all problems, will be able to do anything. He talked about Da Vinci's kind of growing despair at man being able to do that, but the idea was coming out, I can do what I will, just give me till tomorrow. That's Renaissance man, that's modern man, that's man as his own authority, as the center of everything. What else stood out? Yeah.
The center of their ideals started with man being autonomous, and then they built everything else on top.
Okay. Yeah. So the shift in thinking that's mirrored in the art is that man becomes the center, man then becomes autonomous. And what's the problem with that he mentions several times? What's the problem? What's that? Makes truth relative. Okay, that's from the standpoint of the idea of truth. And from the standpoint of man and living as man, what is the problem?
There's no unity. Everything just becomes mechanics.
Okay, there's no unity, mechanics, and he said that, was it Leonardo da Vinci anticipated the idea of man is just a machine, which is, by the way, probably one of the main thoughts coming through in the Matrix movies, that whole confusion of human, machine, and so forth. All right, and what else? What's the extension of that then? Huh? Man is finite, which then results in what?
Discouragement?
Huh?
Discouragement?
Discouragement over what? You're getting there.
Mortality.
Okay, mortality, but meaning. He says basically if you start with man, if you start with the particulars, there ultimately is not a base for meaning, for truth, for love, and then personhood eventually is what becomes destroyed. And as you go on through the flow of Western thought, and you'll be seeing this in Sire, what's your next Sire chapter do? What is it on? Naturalism? Deism. Okay, you're not quite there yet. But when you get to naturalism, naturalism will be this idea that there is no spiritual out there. We're just part of the universe. But then the natural outcome of that is meaninglessness, absurdity. And so nihilism is what results, and man can't live in that. So then the rest of the quest of Western philosophy will be how to reintroduce a basis for meaning and value and significance. And so that becomes the struggle now. And I think Schaeffer rightly identifies the Renaissance as the great dividing point, the great point of where he said the die was cast, man had put himself at the center, and that meant that there was going to then be a continual quest and struggle for how do you have a sufficient basis for meaning and value and purpose and dignity and so forth if you start with the particulars instead of the absolute God. And so your reading in Sire and the rest of these videos will explore that whole downward plunge and then how man is trying to get back up, but it will never quite make it. Okay, what else stood out to you?
I thought it was really interesting just learning more about David, because you always hear it. I mean, it's...
The statue, David? Yeah. He doesn't mention it here. It may be in the reading, and you may have caught it, that last image of David. Did you notice the size of his hands? If you were to read it, if you go and measure it, the hands are too big for the rest of the body. Now, do you think Michelangelo just messed up there? The point that's often made is no, because it's amplified humanity. It's, the hand is the instrument of doing, the instrument of accomplishing. That's even the metaphor in the Bible. And so man can do whatever he needs to do. Now, if that's true, if the hands are disproportionate from the rest of the body, that's a statement about something. And that's the point that would emphasize or underscore the point that he makes, that this isn't the biblical David. I mean, the biblical David was a man whose strength was God, who could stand up to Goliath, who was much bigger than him because God was on his side, not because he could do it. And that's completely contrary to the humanist idea of the Renaissance. And so, in fact, here's a man unlike any man. This is perfected man, and there is no man like that. But yeah, that's a different take than what we see often interpreted, isn't it? Yeah, Gwen?
One of the things that struck me that the guy said was that he said with Michelangelo's stuff that it's men tearing themselves out of the rock,
okay,
and that man will be victorious. And I was like, oh.
Yeah, that was the sculptors that was mentioned right before David, where you walk into this exhibit, and they originally thought it was unfinished, and then more and more apparently critics realized no, he intended to make a statement, and that is, man is tearing himself out of the rock. Man will finish himself, will accomplish what will be fully man. That is very interesting, isn't it? And that was Michelangelo's at least original philosophy. Okay, other things? Again, Plato. Yeah.
I think it was interesting how he described humanism as just pessimism, and kind of how it's just a rejection of wanting to believe in something more.
Yeah, humanism doesn't act pessimistically, but the point he makes is that it ultimately ends in pessimism because man can never quite get there. Man can never really be there. And it naturally does lead to a pessimism, to a discouragement. And I think that's the point he makes at the end of Da Vinci's life, that Da Vinci became pessimistic over being able to arrive at value and meaning, starting with the particular, starting with man. And remember, he said he tried to paint the soul. He tried to go there. Maybe the artist can bring it all together. And he suggests at that point that no, that was something else. I'm going to go there. So right, that the natural consequence is a pessimistic outcome. But the Renaissance began, and it continues through today, with a basic optimistic view of what man can do, though that is not really supported by the evidence, nor is it supported by the totality of human experience. Good. What else? Kind of makes you want to buy the whole thing and review it every 6 months, doesn't it? Yeah.
I thought it was interesting how, you talked about as people adopted more and more humanistic thinking, then at first it was just religious values that went, and then from there it led to just all knowledge.
Right. Yeah, that first the conflict was religious value against the humanistic ideals, but then it eventually came to be a blow at the basis for all knowledge, for all certainty. Yeah. And I think this is how the Renaissance is usually characterized as the overthrowing of the elements that came out of the Middle Ages, which was dominated by the church, dominated by Christian ideals, going back to the classics of Rome and Greek, and therefore liberating human beings from this religious stuff which makes them depreciate what life is, depreciate this world. And once we get over that, then we can go ahead and become what we're meant to become what we can as human beings. I think that is a simplistic summary of what the humanistic contribution often is considered. But in reality, as Schaeffer points out, it strikes at the very possibility of having true meaning and significance because it removes any absolute base. And these artists weren't all non-Christians. In fact, majority of them out of the Renaissance were Christians, and they were not doing their art and so forth to overthrow God's rulership of the world or the absolute of the truth of the Bible. They were really doing it in celebration. And the next video on the Reformation, he will point that out, that in the north of Europe, you do not have this humanistic ideal taking off. You really have the Christian artists and so forth flourishing in that their art is united with their faith and with their belief in an absolute. So the Renaissance isn't one or the other, but it did go the direction of humanism ultimately, as he points out. Yeah, Joy?
I was wondering, do you think that they were really thinking about these things, with the whole thing with space around the people, and were they thinking, oh yeah, we're going to put man in the center? Is it just portrayed, how do you tell?
Well, how do you tell that that's really what they're thinking is your question, that we're not putting those thoughts into their heads? Well, it would be, it is an interpretive exercise. You would do it by what you see. You would do it by what they wrote. You would do it by some of the ideas that would be expressed, and it would be taking the whole together. And for sure, not everybody is going to have this same interpretation, but it is clear. And the thing is that he mentions this. It does come out stated clearly in the writings of the philosophers, but he says it usually first appears in things like art. And so the fact that these ideas do become ensconced in literary communication would say that's what people were thinking. Now, does that fit with what you see in art? And that's the kind of a way, that's the way that you would weigh that. But it's not to say, and Schaeffer would agree with this statement, or actually makes this statement, it doesn't mean that it is always a consciousness. And I think he states, maybe even here, that a person's worldview will come out in art and so forth. It might be unconsciously. They might not be trying to make a certain statement, but if they have imbibed of the mentality, the culture, the spirit of the age, it will be reflected in their art. And so it might not always be, and he says sometimes it's a reflection, sometimes it's a prophecy. In other words, art. Sometimes it's simply reflecting what they've adopted, and various artists would be more or less conscious of it. So, and it's not going to be the same for everyone, but it is an interpretive exercise. But there's no question, and see what Sire's going to do is show you how this comes out in writings, and Schaeffer is showing you how it's reflected in culture and the movements of culture and things like government and literature and art and architecture and so forth. And that's why I like to use these two sources together. That's a good question and a good thought. Okay, he will refer back to the Renaissance as we move on through this series. So this is important. If you're interested in going back and looking at some of the details and getting the spelling of all these names, Giotto and Boccaccio, and all of those. Again, the companion volume with this is How Should We Then Live? The Rise and Decline of Western Thought and Culture. It is not a transcript of the video series, but the chapters do contain the information that he has, and contains most, if not all, of the images he'll use, plus more. And so, if you want to pursue this, it would give you more of some of the technical background. Now, again, it's still a summary, it's still an overview. As an introduction to looking at Christian theism and just thinking through the categories that give us the biblical answers to those worldview questions that everyone has an assumed answer to. We've been looking at how Paul very skillfully, very intelligently relates to the two of the philosophical schools at Athens, the Epicureans and the Stoics. And the emphases that he makes, we see counter each of their main errors with regard to God. One of which said God is just part of the whole, everything is one. The soul, the divine, the world idea. The other, there is no God, it's just man, it's just nature. And in his counter to the Epicureans, that God is emphasized in his immanence, which remember is to be distinguished from immanent and eminent. Immanent. Get it? Don't worry about it. I won't give you an audio test on those three words. He talks about how God is involved with humanity, and so he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth. So we see here that there's also a view of man. God is involved in the affairs of mankind. He is knowable as a person, and so this states important things about the person of God. So that we see that from the standpoint of Christian theism, God is both immanent and transcendent. He is not removed, neither is he just part of the whole. And these are the two large categories in terms of the characteristic of God that gives us the answer to the fundamental reality. What is the fundamental reality? There is a being apart from the material universe who is responsible for and involved in the material universe. And so philosophical schools tend to diminish one of those to uphold the other. In the course of this, though, we can also see that he says some significant things about mankind. He's God's offspring. And there the idea is that human beings ultimately are the creation of God. We are made in his likeness. We serve as his image on earth. Life has dignity. Mankind has dignity. Life is sacred. Though alienated from God, redeemable to a favored position. So there are tons of stuff in here that really do lay out the whole big picture. And all of the worldview categories that we'll be looking at, God, man, death, history, ethics, they're all in here. They're all in here in seed form as Paul makes these comments. Now remember that if you read through this speech, it takes a few seconds or a couple of minutes. Now, do you think that's all the amount of time that Paul spent in laying this out to the philosophers? No. Luke has summarized what he has said to give us the essence of it, but Paul would have fleshed this out. Paul would have talked to them and drawn the implications of it and so forth. So we have the outline, and it is a succinct outline, but it is a complete outline of world view categories. And of course, the physical universe is created, it's dependent. And so I think we do see here in this passage that this is perhaps the most important passage in the Bible in regard to, as Christians, how we should be aware of the worldview options that there are and how we can use this to bridge what they conceive of the universe as it really is from our understanding of the Bible as truth, as Francis Schaeffer emphasizes. So that brings us to Christian theism, lay it out in some detail, and to look at these categories. God is really there, so man is real. Man is not an illusion, man is not God, but man is, and is something specific because God is. And that's the beginning point. We have evidence for it. God has made us to be able to think about that, to have an intuitive sense that there is a personal God. It is revealed in the Bible, and so that's the starting point. As we've said, the foundation of Christian theism is God who is there, and He's not silent. In fact, Francis Schaeffer wrote a book entitled that, He is there and He's not silent. And it is laying that out, that there really is a God who is separate from the universe, who created it, and He is not silent. He has entered into the affairs of man. He has revealed Himself in the Word. He has revealed Himself in Jesus Christ, and therefore that is an authoritative revelation that gives us truth. And so again, as I said before, this isn't new things. We're not reinterpreting the Bible. We're simply taking what the Bible tells us about God and arranging it in these categories that have to do with worldview, so that we can both compare the kinds of things we run into that people say and be able to intelligently relate to people with some categories in mind. And, the thing is that people are asking the wrong sources and the wrong authorities for answers to the big questions in life. And here's a Bloom County cartoon. What's the nature of God? Oliver Wendell Jones is asking his computer. And so it clicks and pings, and he says, intellectually, how can man ever truly grasp the concept of infinity and eternity? It clicks and it whirs and it's thinking. We've got supposedly the beginnings of artificial intelligence in the computer world. Is existence only an illusion and the universe merely someone's wistful, glorious dream? The computer clicks and whirs as though it's going to come up with the answer. Why the heck does anybody really need a home computer? Now at that, it gets a little bit miffed and it blows up. And he says, there are realms of the mysterious that man should never poke into. Well, a humorous consideration, but the whole point is, don't ask a computer about the nature of God. Ask God. But you see, the modern mind doesn't believe that God is going to say anything if there is a God, that the Bible is simply what men have made up about God. And so they're more inclined to go on the internet to ask their computer or something else for this kind of information. And again, I appreciate Schaeffer because with all of his analysis of culture and so forth, he still says there is only one reliable source for truth in reality, and that is what God has said in the Bible. So we're going to look at the Bible to answer these most fundamental questions about ultimate reality. In other words, who's out there? Well, God. God who is both infinite and personal. Both infinite and personal. As infinite, God is uncreated, therefore unlimited by anything. He alone is self-existent. Now that's a critical starting point. And once you accept that, once that becomes a foundational truth, everything else flows from that. So God knows all things. He's everywhere present. He's all-powerful, not bounded by time. And He's sovereign. Nothing is beyond His ultimate interest, control, and authority. Now, even Christians differ on how exactly He controls, how exactly this control is manifested of the totality of the cosmos. But we do not debate the fact that He is ultimately in control of all, because He alone is infinite. And so He stands outside of it. He's responsible for it. And that has to do like with his transcendence. But he is also personal, as we have seen. He possesses self-consciousness, self-reflection, that is, having mind and emotions, and self-determination, having a will. There's no flaw or incompleteness in his self-awareness, and no limits upon his determined will. And as personal, God can communicate truth. He can reveal himself so that we can know him personally. Now, when we get to thinking about who is man, we're going to have to go back to God. Because if we're created like him, and if we're created to have communion with him and fellowship with him, then we have to be able to communicate and receive communication, don't we? So you see, this is why we start here. We start with God, because that answers the question of who is man. So we have this, and there is someone there. There is someone ultimate who is there to ground our highest aspirations, our most precious possession. That is personality. So that's important. Now, within the personhood of God, we also say, and as personal, that he's triune. There's one God, but three persona. I'm not going to try to explain this. Nobody can really understand and explain it. You can simply say it's not three different beings, it's one being, but there are actually three aspects of that one being. He's triune. Now, the practical point that we make here is that God exists in and for relationship. If you take that statement at the beginning of Genesis, let us make man in our image, as the Trinity conferring together, it lends us to the conclusion that, God didn't need us to have companionship. God, in his triune nature, has companionship, perfect companionship. And so, as he is a relational being already in his eternality, so he has created us to be relational beings. So the Trinity is not something that man comes up with for some obscure reason. I don't know why man would come up with something like that, though that's a skeptical view of the whole doctrine of the Trinity. It works much better the other way. Because God is a relational being in himself, that is how he has made us, for relationship with himself, for relationship with each other. So there is someone. I'll go back to this slide. You can write this down over across on the page. There is someone ultimate who is there to ground our highest aspirations, our most precious possession, personality. We are persons. And as persons, we intuitively recognize there's something special about us that is not like any other creature that we actually have evidence of. Unless there really are aliens who have last landed at Area 51. We're it. We are the pinnacle of God's sentient, that is, thinking, a conscious, self-aware creation. And so, how do we ground that? What is the basis for us having this significance and this sense of dignity? And that goes back to what we just saw with Schaeffer's video today in terms of the Renaissance. What is a sufficient basis for valuing ourselves beyond simply a part of the mechanistic universe or an animal, a high animal? Well, it's because of the personhood of God that we are persons. And again, we'll come back to this when we get to discussing what a human being is. Oliver Wendell Jones is on his living room. How do I say that? He's on his house. Lonely and shivering, the famed astronomer keeps a midnight vigil for the comet. A few years back, the comet Kohoutek was making a pass by the Earth so that we could see its tail. I don't think most of you were alive maybe at the time. Anyway, scanning the vast, savage reaches of the cosmic void, his mind wanders to the fantastic, to the unfathomable. Could he be staring into the very face of God himself? Now, Carl Sagan is a famous atheistic or agnostic scientist who said the universe is all that is, all that was, all that is, all that ever will be. We are not looking for God. But he was looking for intelligent life. He was part of the scientific community that had these great big audio telescopes. What are they called? Audio isn't the right word. Anyway, they're listening, Radio telescopes, all right. They're listening for sounds from outer space that could be detectable as communication. In other words, don't know what the language would be. And so he is looking for something. Well, with that in the background, you see Opus seeing him up on the roof and sneaking up on him, and he goes bleh, looks into his telescope, which casts Oliver Wendell off of the roof, and he says something to him, to which Opus responds, "No, I certainly do not think that Carl Sagan would have handled that situation with more poise." In other words, would Carl Sagan, if he saw God through his telescope, would he have accepted it and said, "Oh, I was wrong"? Or would he have fallen off the roof backwards and broken his neck? So the question of God's existence, it's serious. People seriously deny it, just as they seriously accept it. And yet there's this sense of what is out there in the universe, and what is out there in the universe has something to do with who we are here in this little tiny pocket of the universe. So even the person who denies uncategorically the existence of God still feels like there needs to be something external to validate who we are, something external to give us some kind of information about that. He's sitting on his roof another night. It just goes on and 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 on. Have you ever looked out at the stars and got no ground light? Iowa's a good place to do that. And you look around and you say, wow, it just goes on and on and on. What's the result? Well, for us it may be wonder, but it can be a little bit unnerving. He's in his bed, tucked in his covers. Infinity is a notion best contemplated inside four walls with sheets tucked snugly around one's toes. You see, if the universe is an impersonal infinity, then one is insecure and can only manufacture inadequate security structures. However, if the infinite is personal and caring, then there is a supplied security that is unassailable and unending. And this is just what Christian theism provides. A God who is both infinite and yet personal. And so we can relate to Him and He to us.